Hi, I'm Tom Thrun. I'm a third generation farm family from the community here of McFarland. And my folks farmed out here on Highway AB and Sigilco Road, about 3 miles east of town, and went to the McFarland schools all the way through. And my dad and his farm, his parents, my grandparents, farmed on the next farm down road, AB, and it used to be Brant Road up until the 1960s when it was made a county highway. And anyway, old-fashioned farm, self-sustaining. My parents married in 1944, so that's when my dad bought the next farm up the road, and actually helped with his new farm and his parents' farm until they passed on. And it's all on the southeast corner of the Hare Hills Golf Course, just as a reference point here out by the freeway. You'll see a lot of pictures here of other area farms that the McFarland Historical Museum is featuring this summer. My display here of our family farm will stay up and be here every Sunday through the summer and into the fall. Come September, they'll bring all the third grade classes through here, and I get to teach the kids how to play farm, because kids don't know how to play farm anymore. And I'll show them how to call cows like this. Come boss! At the top of their lungs, there'll be 20 of these little kids calling cows. And then I take them through, which is what I'm going to do here right now. I don't have the big house made yet, so I made the barn and the silo for my kids in 1994. And the rest of this, as I retired, became my project during the pandemic. So 2020, 21, and right up to the present is when I built the rest of the farm buildings. The original farm had a little milk house right here, made of bricks, and where the farmers would put their large milk cans into the water tank to cool until the truck came to take the cans of milk to the local dairy. And my dad built a larger, newer milk house right attached to the barn, and later you might be able to see inside there the tank and everything, and the pipe where the water would go out to the cow tank in the cow yard later in the day, and then we'd run fresh cold water for the next day into the barn. But we use this then to keep the chicken feed that would then go to the chicken house, and we'll take you around there. My mom would fill a large pail of water twice a day to take down to the chicken houses. We only had running water and electricity to the barn, and everything else had to be carried. Well, we had electricity to the garage building too, in the granary. But you'll see as we go around, I'll open all these roofs. I've made this a rather family historical piece that I've got photos going back, some of them 100 years, showing the barn, the grain, and other aspects as we go through this. So all the roofs tip up. Inside the milk house, there's pictures of when they actually constructed that and poured the cement by hand. So this all started in '44. My dad built a bigger granary building, and with a garage underneath for the cars, 2 tractors in here. And when you come around, there'll be more pictures here of the granary building, because on the top side there was a drive-in from Sigilco Road. We as kids used to wait up here for the school bus, and then we'd back loads of grain in, and I would have to shovel the grain into an elevator, which you'll see in here, and that would go into the various bins that we had for the grain and storage of other items, the corn planter and things. More pieces like that here showing the bins, and a little more history written down here. Besides that, on this podium right here, I've got a 120-page memoir with probably 300 to 400 photographs. I haven't counted them, all by season of the crops and things that we did as a family. And I'm still working on that. And then I also have one other binder back here of 48 pages, which is poetry. I left the farm, as did my 2 sisters. I was an English journalism major and actually came back and was editor of the McFarland paper here 1976 and 77, got married, and went on to some other places. So I've got a lot of ties to this community. And so the barn, you'll see, has the straw mow, the hay mow. There's a hay fork here. My mom used to drive the horse, and I don't have it set up right now, but we can do that later. And it pulls the hay into the barn. And that's what they used before they had elevators. We had workhorses until 1964. Pulled the tobacco planter, the potato planter. They hauled the loads of manure, hay, grain loads. I was just getting old enough to drive them, but then when we had to sell them, they got old. And my dad bought a small Farmall Cub tractor, basically to replace the horses, and I learned to cultivate. Couldn't even reach the pedals the first year I was on this thing. It was really hard. And so I would spend all my summers hoeing and cultivating 4 acres of potatoes, 4 acres of corn, tobacco. Tobacco is a major crop around here throughout Stoughton and the area up through to DeForest, and then there's another bunch up in Westby, Viroqua. And that was a cash crop. It paid the taxes. It sent 3 of us kids through college. Whereas the chicken money, from my mom selling eggs every day to neighbors and relatives, I helped buy groceries. We raised pigs and sold feeder pigs, and that again was another small cash crop in itself. Besides the calves, every year we would keep 2 or 3 to raise again, but then the rest would be sold to market. And so it was a self-sustaining farm. We didn't spend a whole lot on chemical fertilizers. We had our own manure pile. My dad did not like to use herbicides very much. Consequently, we as kids hoed and hoed and hoed. Tobacco and potatoes and sweet corn all by hand all summer long. We never got to the lake to swim with the other kids, but that was okay. It was just the way we were brought up. My dad was born in 1912, the year the Titanic sank, and so he was already 42 years old when I and my twin sister came along, so we probably had the oldest parents of any of the kids in school at that time. And we just did what we were asked, and we were happy. We got to do things, have our own fun. This wood stave silo, as we go around here, these came as kits from northern Wisconsin, and virgin fir lumber out of northern Wisconsin, not a knot in any of those 18-foot long boards. They came by rail car to the lumber yards in McFarland, Cottage Grove, and all the other lumber yards around here, Stoughton, Oregon. And farmers built wood stave silos, and then they went on to build concrete silos. Some had tile. Ours is, I think there's only a couple of these left in Dane County that I'm aware of, near Sun Prairie. They had corn cribs where I would have to help shovel the corn in by hand while my dad milked. We'd go to school, and at supper time he'd milk cows, and I'd be out here in the moonlight shoveling corn into the cribs in October and November. Get around here, we had 12 cows, and just enough room on this side, and we did not have an electric barn cleaner like a lot of the farmers, because they typically broke a lot. My dad said, well, you got a pitchfork and a wheelbarrow. That's how we clean barns here. And so you'll see some of that on the back side. I've got a pig house here too, with photos of the pig house my dad built and how I modeled mine afterwards. I've got all the little pens inside, which are adjustable. And corn in the fall, well, it was still green before it froze. We brought in some of it by wagon loads as we start opening the field. And this is a silo filler. You bring the corn stalks in on a hay rack and shove them through here. They get chopped up and blown into the silo. And every day in the fall and the winter, when the cows had to stay in overnight all winter long, they would each get a scoop of feed night and morning of silage, ground corn, and then with some ground oats and other corn and stuff mixing called cow feed that we'd get milled down here at the mill, which was right on the corner by the tracks. It's no longer here. But I went there with my dad as a little kid. Being a tobacco, a lot of the families raised tobacco. We had a tobacco shed until it blew down from a lot of high winds and old age. And I've got family pictures here, but the tobacco crop, as much as the cows and that was every day, the tobacco was very seasonal. It started in April with the steaming, the sterilizing of the ground in a hotbed that would raise the plants. And I'd have to water this every morning before school with a sprinkle can. The night before, I'd run a hose from the barn over and fill the barrels so the water would be air temperature, not too cold. And then we would raise the plants up till they're about that big, pull them out by hand into bushel baskets, take them out to the my dad, my uncle in the field until I got big enough to run the tobacco planter. And so my dad would sit way on the back here. I've got a picture of this. And it shows my dad on the back and me driving the small Farmall Cub tractor. Once I got 10 years old, I helped with all the field work with my dad. And so then there'd be rows and rows, about 4 acres of tobacco. We'd hoe it, my sisters and I. Then come harvest time, it would get chopped off by hand with a tobacco axe and then speared onto wood lats, and those would be hung into the shed till they dried like this. And then come November, you get a foggy day. We had these doors on the side that we'd open up, and the moist, foggy air would go into the shed and make those brittle leaves supple again. And then we'd spend our Christmas vacations taking all the leaves off, my sister and I, in the barn. We had heat lamps above our fingers to keep them from freezing. But it was a good life. We listened to the radio, sang song, fed the calves Pepsi. You know, we had fun while we were doing it. But we didn't get to do other fun things, Christmas vacation, like the other kids. I've made replicas of a lot of things that I couldn't buy. I made a grain drill here. Again, I used a lot of Tinker Toys, erector set parts, just things that I could craft together to create a lot of this. I got coffee stirring sticks just to make the tobacco lats here that would go in the shed. And we've got other machines here, like my dad's combine. 1946 John Deere was pulled behind, only cut 5 feet at a time. So it would take for a couple days just to harvest the 8 acres of wheat, besides the oats. And so in between all the other chores that we had with the farm. Same way with baling hay and getting the hay into the barn. I've got pictures over here of some of the early dump rakes that they were used with horses and sideways across the field, and farmers would raise and lower and let the hay roll up and then stop, raise it up, move on to the next row, till they had the whole field with windrows of hay. And initially they used a hay loader and brought that hay in loose to the barn. By the 1940s and 50s, we had a baler. And so this hay would go in here and come out as square bales back there, and there'd be a wagon following. And so there'd be, like here, my sister driving the tractor, the hay baler, my dad pulling the bales up onto the wagon. And here's my twin sister and I. This has got to be about 1960. I think we're all 4 or 5 years old right in this picture. Pig houses, we had fences. We could move the fences around, expand the pastures as needed for the pigs. Same way the cows. Cows could go off here. We had another 40 acres of pasture land. And so they would come back for their water in the cow tank night and morning, and then go into the barn to be milked and then let out at night in the summertime. And then if they didn't come the next morning, even if we called, if the weather was cool, nice, and mosquitoes weren't bad, they didn't want to get up. They're just like people, especially the heifers. I mean, they were like teenagers. So I would have to, my dog and I, we'd go out to the field, we'd find the cows and get them up and make them march all the way to the barn. And I'd wear boots that came up just far enough so I wouldn't get soaking wet in the dew in the morning, because the long broom grass in the cow pasture. I also carried a baseball bat some years, because a couple of times we had a bull that couldn't be trusted out with the cows, and just in case he ever came for me, I was ready to clobber him if I had to. My dad talked about that, and we had healthy respect for bulls, and we never kept them more than 18 months because they just got way too big and too mean. Over here you can see we had a special pen for bulls out in the yard if we needed to put one in there, or we'd back the manure spreader in there in the wintertime and keep it dry from freezing. Over here I have the chicken house. We kept straw in the top of the chicken house, as well as the pig house, to keep the heat in, keep the chickens and pigs from freezing. In here I've created the roost and the little nesting boxes. Nesting boxes are actually pill boxes that you get at Walgreens for your pills. And crafted all of these things, the chicken run. Some of these little tiny rubber chicks, like this one, dates from the 1950s. So it's somewhere between 70 and 80 years old probably. And the fact that they've survived this long is just miraculous. I found a bag of these at a garage sale, and I thought, wow, that's awesome. So I've added to a lot of this since I started building. Back here I have another corn crib, the door where we would take the corn out. And here's where I would shovel corn in, again at moonlight lawn nights after school. And there was a little feed room here where they kept the chicken feed that my mom would carry over into the chicken house. We had a little outhouse, got that over here. And we built this addition to the barn. Besides the bullpen, there was also an extra garage for a second tractor. And I helped my dad with that in the 1970s when I was a teenager. This is my tree house I built out of old shed lumber when I was like 11 years old. And I would climb up there on rainy days when we couldn't farm and just hang out. And I had bluegills and small sunfish in the cow tank where the cows drank. So I could sit up there and, you know, fish and catch my little fish and then throw them back in. And I carry worms. Every night my dad threw the old wash water pail out on the other end of the barn by the silo, so I would dig night crawlers and worms there, chuck them into my overall pockets and walk around and feed my fish. My mom always wondered, well, how do your pants pockets get so dirty? I said, well, I got to carry my worms somehow. And so that's the story behind that. The farm was actually built by the Norwegian farmer, the Knut Andersen, I think was the family, around the turn of the 1900s, about the same time as my grandfather's farm down the road. My dad was born in 1912 and then got married when he was 32 years old. And so in 1944, he bought, this farm became available right up the road. That's when he bought it and started farming our farm. And then I came along with my twin sister, and I were born 10 years later. My older sister's 7 years older. She said, boy, I'm glad you came along. I had to be the boy and do all the work until you came along. Yeah, but so my sisters worked just as hard as I did, picking up rocks and doing a lot of things. Yeah, so the barn was turn of the beginning of the 20th century in the silo, and the house, and then the milk house, and then the other buildings were all that my dad made 1940s and 50s. I think the tobacco shed was original to the farm, and it only stood until the 1960s and blew down. And then we had to rent a couple of neighbors' sheds on the next farm over that were newer. Back when I was little, we had horses, and we brought bales into the farm, and we'd park the wagon and the bales on that end of the barn, and my mom would be driving the horse here on what we call a hay fork rope, and because the thing that grabbed the bales was called the hay fork, common to every old barn in the area. And so my dad would say, go ahead, which meant he had everything ready, and my mom would say, giddy up, and our horse would pull the bales into the barn, and then they would back up and repeat the process. They'd do 8 bales at a time, so after about 3-4 times we'd have the load cleared and bring the second load in and then go back out to the field and bale 2 more loads at a time usually. The horses were kept in stalls right inside the barn door here. They went in and out the main barn door. Kept a little gate here just in case a calf got out, or to keep the dog in away from people if we needed to. And that's all shown right here in that picture. So this door wasn't there, it was actually just a barn wall, but I put that in just to show people. And you'll see here the farm in the wintertime. We banked the buildings with straw and hay to help keep the draft out. And there's the wood silo again. And the barn roof by 1960s was starting to sag, so my dad had put a special cable through the middle to tie those beams together so it wouldn't collapse. Boards are getting old. And he even patched the roof with the shingles were getting old. We got some aluminum printer sheets from the local printing shop, the Courier Hub in Stoughton, and we tucked those under the shingles and patched holes that way for a while. So the barn, was already 60 years old when I was a kid, and survived another 30 years until we sold the farm, and then they bulldozed the whole thing down because the last 10, 15 years the roof did rot and it all did go to heck. And my dad decided that when they first surveyed for the interstate freeway, would have cut our farm in half. And he had been thinking about modernizing and putting up a new barn and storage sheds and things. But when that happened, he decided, well, he's just going to keep going the way he was. And by that time they figured out that we'd probably go to college and wouldn't keep the farm anyway. And so my mom stayed there, and I helped her with some of the farm work after my dad passed for 4 years. And then we had the farm auction. Every morning my mom, besides having to wash the dishes, she'd come out and scrub the milk pails in the milk house for my dad, water her flowers around the yard. She worked probably as harder than the rest of us too. At night, she'd do supper, clean the dishes. My sisters would help. I would help sometimes. And then she would have to iron clothes. Before they had permanent pressed clothes, a lot of overalls and things. And then she would have to go to the basement and wash chicken eggs and put them in the cartons, either taken to the Piggly Wiggly in Stoughton and sold, or sold to the neighbors and relatives out of the back door of the house. So there's always people coming and going. And then we sold sweet corn and potatoes the same way, just keeping enough for our own use over winter. My dad would sit in the garage after milking at night and sort in September, October, after we got done picking potatoes by hand, he would sort them by size, make sure there weren't any rotten ones. We'd put them back in the gunny sacks and paper sacks, and some people would buy just what they needed in the neighborhood. This is where we washed up when we came in from the field, and because we were just too filthy to go in the house, we had a water pail and a dipper, a wash dish, and a jar of group soap, a little towel handy. My mom always made sure that was ready for us, and then we sometimes used the milk house as a changing room. Keep an extra pair of overalls in there. You'll see the bags of chicken feed in there. A lot of the scaling for the barn, let me walk around to the other side and grab a cow. Toy cow about this size, it just fits in a young child's hand very nice. And we'd buy, a cow similar to this would be 10 cents or 20 cents at the Schultz Brothers Variety Store in Stoughton. But you'll see over here how I made stanchions to fit the size of the cow, which drove the size of the barn, which drove the size of the silo, trying to keep everything in scale. And then it also was proportional to the machinery that we bought as kids at the time. This is my original disc. This is an extra drag I bought along the way. I had a single section drag behind here that got lost along the way, but I have replaced that. But this was, I think, 59 cents, and the drag was probably another 59 cents, and I asked for both in the same day, and my parents said no, that was too much, so I only got one piece at a time. Anytime we went to Stoughton to buy groceries or get ground feed made for the cows at the mill. So that kind of drove the size of everything. Same way the pig house that my dad made. I've got the pigs are all about this size, down to the baby pigs, the feeder pigs, and made the pens and everything proportional to what my dad's pig house looked like. A lot of the toy machines I have here, the cast ones that are painted, I've found, this shows like an old time corn binder that did the corn shocks that were then stood up in the field. A lot of these were made especially for the kids during the Amish farming community in western Wisconsin. So they're relatively new to me, but each one still is probably about 40, 50 years old. But then there's other machines that I couldn't buy, namely the grain drill. So I crafted that out of old paint sticks and even sewing bobbins on the back in chains that would help cover the seeds. The tobacco planter, I created that with a spool, a bunch of pieces from an erector set. These little, the horse evener and the individual eveners behind the horse, they're made of Tinker toys. You asked about, not spending a lot, so I repurposed a lot of my toys just for this. The framework inside the tobacco shed actually is Lincoln logs glued together. So I created the grain drill, the tobacco planter, the dump rake, and even the potato planter. That we'd have two horses on. My dad would sit back here, my uncle would sit here, drive this very slowly across the field, chain driven from the wheels. Potatoes would come out the back here, and my dad would make sure that one would go down every foot or so into the ground through a little chute and then get covered and buried properly with the little disc wheels on the back. And I've got pictures of our original one right here, the day of the farm auction. And then over here, not a very good picture, but the potato planter. A couple of guys from McFarland came out to get their picture taken, along with our horses, Tom and Dick. You'll see the hills, the rows of potatoes that are already planted there, kind of as ridges. And then I've written all the history here on all these little plaques, as well as in that large memoir book that I have over here, and also my book of poetry. I call it Faith of Our Farming Family Living Still. There's an old Lutheran hymn, Faith of Our Fathers Living Still. I don't know if they still sing it much in Lutheran churches along with those other old hymns. So I've captured a lot of what it was like to be farming in here. I wrote about my mom making tapioca pudding, and where I first started writing poetry in the old manure spreader parked out on the edge of the pasture after we stopped using it because we sold the horses. So I would spend my evenings after milking out there in the pasture where I started writing when I was in high school. There's even pictures and accounts in here of when they dredged the ditches through the marshes back in the 20s. These were taken by my aunt at the time. She was born in 1900. And so it was taken in the 1920s, and it shows the ditch that was carved through the peat marshes so the farmers could have more corn ground.